Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
Alan is known to us as a professor emeritus of political science at Wellesley. In a previous session, he shared his work as a former chairman of the Fulbright program. This experience has given him a depth of experience in seeing the breadth of cultural experiences. He and his wife, Allison, have also taken their trailer, spending time traveling through the South and Southeast. They've observed the effect of globalization and immigration in their travels as they've gone through the Appalachian area. They have seen how life has changed in the Rust Belt area, and this has given Alan their perspective on why Donald Trump became so popular. He will spend time today talking about the first year of Trump's He will spend his time talking about the forgotten Americans and the Appalachian crisis, and I think that has a lot to do with Trump, and that's why I said that. We gave you the New Yorker review of Hillbilly Elegy, which addresses the life in the Rust Belt.
I'm delighted to be here again. Can you hear me in the last row? This article, The Lives of Poor People, most of you I saw when I came in this morning are reading it right here and now. So if you haven't finished it, obviously take it with you and read it later. It's the best review of J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, which created a storm last year. And if you didn't get a copy or you want to refer it to friends, it's online. All you need to do is Google New Yorker, The Lives of Poor White People, and it comes up immediately. That's where I read it once again last night. I've also passed out, because I thought it would be useful, a one-page sheet about Appalachia with information on both sides. And let me start out by saying I'm not going to talk primarily about Trump. I'm only going to do a little bit about Trump because many of us are so worried and concerned about Trump, and we follow it so much in the news or on the TV. That was not the purpose of the talk. Nearly all of us were shocked by the outcome of the 2016 election a year ago. And of course that shock hasn't worn off because of what has happened during the first year of the Trump presidency. Things are going to happen this week. Every week, if not every day, there's something important, a potential crisis blooming. We realize, or I realized certainly, but many of you did as well, that we don't understand our own country. We thought we did. We live in a bubble here in New England and in Wellesley. Most of us have a very casual acquaintance with the red states. We need to study them in depth to learn as much as we can. So that's why I'm doing this talk. I've chosen to focus on Appalachia for two reasons. First, the most significant book that came out of the 2016 election cycle was J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy. There's no question about that. It has sold over 1 million copies in the period since it was published a little over a year ago. The second reason I chose to focus on this topic is because Ann Dobier asked me to do so. Ann knows that my wife and I have traveled a great deal in the region of Appalachia over our adult lives. I began to study the region back in the early 1960s during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations when the poverty program was developed and the arguments in Washington about what the government should do about poverty in America. So today I'm going to do two things. One, I want to do an analysis of the region and the politics of the region. And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit about personal experiences there. And then I'll stop and we can, hopefully we can have a conversation, questions and comments from all of you. Now, our popular image of Appalachia has been shaped by movies like Deliverance. Most of you know the movie Deliverance. Stories about violent family feuds, the Hatfields and the McCoys. TV programs like Beverly Hills Hillbilly, that was, millions of people watched that for a number of years. And then stories about backwoods stills and moonshiners and revenuers back in the 20s and the 30s. Vance's book, while fascinating and disturbing, uses his own personal experiences to illustrate the dysfunctional and self-destructive nature of hillbilly life. And in my judgment, it adds to the distorted image held by outsiders because he focuses on where his family was from, which was the the poorest region of Kentucky. Not all of Appalachia is that way, but there's been a generalization about the whole area. Vance's book, in my judgment, adds to the distorted image held by outsiders. So the region has serious problems, there's no question, but one needs to be very careful not to overgeneralize about the whole region. First, some background on the region, its people, and its politics. How do you pronounce it? Most of us don't know. I had to look it up again. Appalachia, Appalachian. If you go to Google and you say, pronounce Appalachia or Appalachia, which is what most of us have always said, they look down on outsiders who mispronounce the name of their mountain region. It's app as in an app on your iPhone, as in obvious, latch as in a latch on a door, Appalachian, Appalachia. That's the proper pronunciation. Second, it's a vast mountainous territory ranging from southwestern New York State to northern Alabama. That's what that map shows. In the Appalachian mountain range are several states are totally in the range, and many states are partially in the range. New York, southern and southwestern New York state, is in Appalachia, and many of the problems that exist in central Kentucky also exist in southern New York, but they're very different in nature because southern New York has a much higher level of income. So it's pretty hard to generalize about the whole region. So imagine a region that goes from southern New York all the way down to northern Mississippi and Alabama. It's an enormous geographic region. There are 25 million people who live in Appalachia in comparison to 14 million in the total New England, 6 New England states. So the population is actually much larger than the New England states. Poverty has existed, not recently, it's existed for many generations. It's not just due to the decline of coal in the last decade or so, although that's obviously made it much, much worse, because of isolation, dependence on natural resources, first timber, then secondly coal, and absence of other sources of income, other sources of opportunity, exploitation by the coal companies when coal boomed, but the last boom of coal was during the Second World War. Before that, the boom before that was during the First World War, when the coal was used for the purpose of the iron and steel industry in the Pittsburgh region along the rivers in southern Ohio, for example, for the production of armaments. And the concentration And then the other big element is very poor education. It wasn't necessary for the residents of Appalachia, many residents of Appalachia, to develop any skills. You didn't need a high school education to become a coal miner. What you needed was muscle, etc. So as long as there were jobs for unskilled people, the Appalachian community, it didn't flourish economically, but it was stable and it was all right. 8 of the 10 poorest counties in America are in Appalachia. 95 of the 100 poorest countries in the U.S., this is just an interesting aside, are in rural counties in red states. The 5 poorest states in America are the poorest, Mississippi, then West Virginia, Arkansas, Alabama, and Kentucky. The median family income in the region is 80% of the median family income nationally, but only 60% in the most distressed counties in central Appalachia. And that map shows you, one side of the map shows you where the most distressed counties are. It's unfortunate to generalize about all of Appalachia on the most distressed count, based on the most distressed counties, because the others are doing almost as well as the national median income. In urban areas in Appalachia, and you can see what the major cities are on the first side of the map. In urban areas in Appalachia, the median family income is close to the median family income nationwide. And of course, the median family income in the city areas of Appalachia is really a better income in terms of living standards than the median family income in Boston or New York or San Francisco. Obviously, money goes a lot further in that region. Now, while coal mining has always been a boom and a bust industry, and hard exploitation of mining families is part of the history of the region, the decline of coal in the last 20 years has really become a disaster. Coal mining provided middle-class incomes. Now there are virtually no opportunities for individuals without a high school diploma. In 1985, there were 178,000 coal miners. By 2012, there were 90,000, and last year there were 56,000. So the speed in which this crisis has developed for the main source of income in the area is incredible. Coal produced 50% of electricity in the United States in 2005, 12 years ago. Now it produces 30% of the electricity of in the country. And it's dropping, it continues to drop sharply as recyclables become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. The introduction of shale oil, shale oil mining has produced much more natural gas, which is cheaper than coal. And so the decline in coal production, and one of the main reasons that coal production is continuing really at all in Appalachia, is that the coal is being exported to China from there, because the Chinese, you've all seen pictures of Beijing with the incredible pollution that exists there. The Chinese are still dependent on coal. They are beginning to talk about, and they're very aware of the popular dissatisfaction with air pollution in China. They also will begin to reduce the use of coal in the next 10 or 20 years. So that outlet may very well virtually disappear. The most important coal states, if you look at the figures online, are first West Virginia, then Kentucky, then Illinois, then central Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, the Appalachian part of Pennsylvania, you probably have heard this derogatory comment. It's called, by people in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, it's called Pennsyltucky. And then finally, Wyoming with surface mining. In 2015, 4 of the major coal companies in the country went bankrupt. More than 25% of them are in bankruptcy today. The price of coal has dropped 50% since 2011. The decline is only going to continue, regardless of what Donald Trump said. But what is relevant is that the Clean Power Plan of Barack Obama, which obviously Hillary and the proponents of the Environmental Protection Agency and increases in environmental protection, clearly was a target for Trump. And we see the result of that in terms of his effort to basically destroy the Environmental Protection Agency and to pull back on the to eliminate the Clean Power Plan as part of his effort, the campaign pledge to bring back coal. The reality is that it is impossible to bring back coal, obviously, because it doesn't just depend on environmental issues. It depends upon the cost of coal production in relation to other sources of energy, and the technology clearly has bypassed that source of energy. Furthermore, these states have much lower levels of education. About 13% of the residents have bachelor's degrees compared to 30% nationally. I think many of us are surprised to learn that only 30% of Americans have bachelor's degrees, 70% do not. Of course, that's an average for the whole population. When you look at people between 20 and 30 nationally, the percentage who have higher education goes up dramatically. In the central region of Appalachia, the most distressed region, 75% of the people do not have a high school diploma. Now you think about that in terms of their potential for economic success or even opportunity to take advantage of economic success. It explains why Vance and other people from Appalachia left the region and went elsewhere, just outside the region in western Kentucky or in northern Ohio in the search of opportunity. Now, on the other hand, serious efforts to expand higher education have been undertaken for more than 20 years, because it's obvious that that's the trend that has to be followed. According to the Appalachian Higher Education Network, which is an agency that exists for the purposes of gathering data and increasing efforts focusing efforts to get kids to stay in high school and get a college education, their latest report is that 41% of high school graduates across the region, compared to 52% nationally, are engaged in higher education of all types. That's not just four-year undergraduate colleges, but the whole range of higher education. I looked up, because I was curious, the state universities of many of the states in the Appalachian region to find out how many people are engaged in undergraduate and graduate education. And I found that at the University of Tennessee and Tennessee State, the two largest institutions, they enroll 56,000 students today. 40,000 are in post-high school education in Kentucky, 76,000 in West Virginia. This is a very different imagery than the image that I've been presenting so far of just the suffering that is going on. These are among the whitest states in the nation, with very few minorities and very little in-migration. The people who are there mostly have been there for generations, going back to the settlement of the states. The white population nationally today is 61%. And one of the mistakes the Democrats made prior to the election, and Hillary made as part of the Democratic thinking, was that the rise of minorities, the increase in minority populations, was the future of American politics. That's true, but not now, and probably not for another decade or so. Because in states like this, the number of minorities is so extremely small. The white population nationally, as I said, is 61%. But in West Virginia, the white population is 93%. In all of these states, the white population is over 70%. It's 73% in Tennessee, which is the lowest of the central population, Appalachian population. But Tennessee has western Tennessee along the Mississippi River. That's an area of Memphis and country music and so forth. So because it's only partially in Appalachia, it has a much more diverse population. And of course, New York State has a substantial minority population, et cetera. Most of the people are fundamentalists, coming from Southern Baptist and Methodist, the major denominations in the region. The dominant religious values in the region reflect the revival meetings of the late 19th century. And you've all seen pictures of that or heard about it. It involves a puritanical morality, Calvinism, fatalism, fundamentalism, zeal for salvation, conversion through personal experience, strong opposition to progressive cultural values. So the cultural values of diversity and equality for women, such things as abortion, such things as gay marriage. Roy Moore may be at the far end of an exception in terms of the views that are characteristic in the region, but he's not that far out. And if he didn't have some of the extreme problems that he has, like the accusations of sexual harassment, obviously he would be far more successful than he's likely to be. The puritanical moralism creates a very serious problem for these churches and the adherents in these churches in the face of a growing secular society with relativism on all kinds of moral issues, more tolerance on all kinds of moral issues, because that's unacceptable to people who have those views. If you ever get a chance to go to Lynchburg, Virginia, go visit Liberty University of Jerry Falwell, the evangelical university there. Allison and I did that once. We were planning to go, a couple of years ago, we were planning to spend an hour because we were curious. We spent the whole day because it was absolutely fascinating. The kids walking around the campus were dressed the way kids dressed in the 50s. White shirts, pants, skirts. The girls were not in pantsuits. And the night lights on the campus, the lampposts on the campus, which all college campuses have a large number of lampposts, because when kids walk around at night, it's potentially dangerous from a safety viewpoint. And on every single lamppost at Liberty University, there was a music box, an outlet box, and they were playing Christian music from every lamppost all throughout the day. It was absolutely fascinating. There's a museum there to the origins of Southern evangelical revivalism, all the history of the radio programs before television that were so popular back then. So it's a good example of a place to get a deep impression of the values of conservative Christianity today. Now let me move on to the election of 2016. All of these states voted for Donald Trump, many of them by astonishing margins. The margins went from 61% for Trump to 69% of the four-candidate vote, not of the just between the two. In other words, Hillary got at most in the central Appalachian states about 25% of the vote, 28% of the vote. The only really competitive state was Pennsylvania, which went by 1% for Donald Trump. And the reason it was 48-47 in the outcome in that state for the two of the four parties, the reason I mention that is because 48 and 47 does not make 100. So you all follow that, not a problem. Was because of the impact of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Of the 8 states that are primarily in the Appalachian zone, 14 senators are Republican, 2 are Democrats. The Republicans control both houses of the state legislature in all 8 states, and the governor's office in 6 of the states. Clearly, the Democratic Party is toothless in that region of the country. Now let me switch to some personal vignettes where we learn more about personally about the region. What happened in the early 1960s is that Democratic Senators Hubert Humphrey and Philip Hart of Michigan were holding hearings on malnutrition in America. All of us assume that Americans, now this is long before the obesity problem. The problem was malnutrition, the absence of fresh food. And what they found was in Appalachia that there were children with rickets and scurvy and other kinds of diseases because of who were physically malshapen. And the television, remember 1960 is the first year that the television was part of the national election cycle. So the awareness of poverty outside of the poor regions of poor people became dramatic as a result of the photographs of poverty that were of malnutrition that were on the television. In addition, Michael Harrington was the author of a book called The Other America. You might have read it at the time if you were interested in this subject. It had an enormous impact, the same way Vance's book had an impact. An occasional book which is not directed at politics, does have a major impact on our perception of what needs to be done or what should be done. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 was passed in a burst of what turned out to be naive optimism. Hillary wrote her thesis with me on the subject of trying to figure out what was the best way to deal with poverty. What should be done to try to alleviate poverty, not in this region particularly, but around the country. And she compared a particular program of the Economic Opportunity Act, the Community Action Program, CAP it was called, of the federal government using those resources down into the local communities. And she compared that with Saul Alinsky and the bottom-up method of community organizing. Barack Obama was a community organizer shortly after he had graduated from law school, with the idea being that you could reduce poverty by putting pressure on governments from the bottom. So it shows you the continuity of this type of concern. Another book entitled Night Comes to the Cumberlands by a young lawyer in the region, Harry Caudle, focused on the squalor, ignorance, and demoralization of many of the local people. And I used to teach from that book. I used that as a means of introducing American poverty to students who were interested in the topic. Congress also passed the Clean Air and the Clean Water Acts and regulated strip mining to reduce the actions of coal company as strip mining developed rather than underground mining. You could produce much more coal much cheaper by surface mining than you could by individual men going into the coal mines, and obviously it was much safer as well. When mountains are stripped in areas like central Appalachia, enormous machines are brought in, tractors, bulldozers, etc. Enormous machines are brought in to remove the surface earth and rock above the coal seam. Sometimes that surface area and rock is 400 feet to get down to the coal seam. And that material, the talus, the material that has to be taken off, has to go somewhere. So what the coal companies did was they just dumped it off to the side. Since this is a mountainous region, the stripped area, the stripped land, frequently went down the hillside into the streams, blocking the streams, polluting the streams, obviously causing very negative consequences. Elise Cherry, who some of you may know, she graduated in the early 1970s. She's the CEO of Boston Community Capital, which advocates for and builds limited income housing in the Boston area, very prominent in this field. I see her once every 4 or 5 years. I saw her last year at a rally for Hillary that was held. She studied all of this with me. She was from Revere. She was somewhat of an odd duck at Wellesley College because she spoke with a slight Revere accent, which didn't quite square with the proper or upper class English of most of the students at the college. Anyway, when she graduated from Wellesley College, she joined the Vista Volunteers, which was one of the programs of the poverty program, Volunteers in Service to America for young people. It was the domestic version of the Peace Corps and came out of the poverty program. And they sent her to Appalachia. She was in rural Appalachia as an assistant in the Frontier Nursing Corps. The Frontier Nursing Corps was a poverty program paid by the federal government to bring nurses and doctors into the rural areas where there were no medical services free for the first time. When Elise returned a year or so later, her comments shook my faith in progress. She said the local people believed that these idealistic outsiders who spoke in a different accent, dialect, than they did, and when she said that, I was thinking, you speak in a different accent than most of us do. She doesn't anymore. Her comments really shook my faith in progress. She said the local people believed that these idealistic outsiders were communists here brought into their region to destroy America because they were outsiders. They didn't fit into the community. Then on a camping trip later in the region, my wife and I sat by the campfire with a can of Budweiser in our hands, which is how you sort of insert yourself into the community, speaking with a group of about 8 young adults in their 30s who had a Confederate flag waving on their pickup trucks. And what they said was quite interesting. They said that Franklin Roosevelt and the TVA destroyed their communities. Now that was very interesting for me because I had been taught, as most of us had been taught, that the TVA was one of the great development projects of the Roosevelt administration. It brought running water into people's houses, which meant they could have toilets rather than outhouses. It brought electricity to the region. It has a very, very positive reputation. Their view was that Roosevelt had destroyed, the TVA had destroyed their communities because in order to create the TVA, you had to have electricity. What was done was to build dams and build reservoirs in order to have hydro power, and those reservoirs flooded the bottom land all over, reducing the amount of land that was available for growing crops, leaving many of them only with hillsides on which you could grow crops. Now think about growing crops on a hillside. It's very hard to do, it's not very productive, and it doesn't work with a tractor. You could do hillside farming with a horse and a plow, but not with a tractor. And they said, we were driven off our land because of the destruction of the bottom land and the fact that we couldn't afford tractors. And at the time they said, well, a tractor used to be $20,000, but now it's $40,000 or $50,000 for a modern tractor, obviously beyond their capacity to farming. Somehow, what they had done was they had left the region, left the center, and gone to cities in and around Appalachia, just outside of Appalachia, where these people had gone into the lawn care, landscape and lawn care business, because that fit in with the knowledge and skills that they already had. So they were working for upper income residents in these other urban areas. Somehow we got onto the subject of the federal safety net for the poor. They told us that the liberals in the government were catering to lazy black people, that the programs, and this is not now, this is about 10 years ago, catering to lazy black people. They brought up the fact that they knew a white woman had married a black man, and the image of them in bed was disgusting. The conversation was deteriorating. When I asked if they knew the book, and I knew they weren't readers, but I said, do you know the book Color of Water? Many of you may have read the book Color of Water, which was written by the son of a mixed racial couple about his experiences. They said, you mean someone else did that? They were obviously thinking of the sexual relationship between two races. Clearly, from their perspective, the federal government was the enemy. It had destroyed their life, and efforts to help, and the efforts of the federal government to help were not perceived as helpful. They were perceived as destructive in nature. On another trip, we were driving in rural Tennessee in 2002 when we came across a sign outside a Southern Baptist church which said the minister would preach next Sunday on the topic, Jesus says invade Iraq now. I turned to Allison and I said, I didn't realize that Cheney was taking orders from Jesus. And Allison was much kinder. She said, if those people are Christians, then I'm not a Christian. Very different from the kind of progressive Christianity that is characteristic of most of the churches, like the one we're in, but in Massachusetts. In nearly all of the rural towns we visited in the region, there were only 3 good buildings. Many empty storefronts, no stores that sold fresh food and vegetables. The 3 good buildings in each town were the school building, obviously getting money in from the state, and in recent years, George W. Bush's program from the federal government. The nursing home, because the people in the nursing home were all on Medicaid, and it was federal money coming in to provide for them. And of course, the third building was always the elaborate brick church or churches in the community. On our most recent trip, 4 years ago, we drove into a small town in the Pennsylvania coal zone because we were out of food. We wanted to go to a grocery store. The name of the town was Mahoney, and I thought it was an Irish name. But it turns out when we spoke to someone that we were mispronouncing it. It's Mahoney. It's an Indian name, not an Irish name. The only grocery store, this person told us, in the town was closed. This is a town of 15,000 people. The only grocery store had closed because it couldn't survive in terms of economics. Other storefronts were abandoned. The houses were all beat up. They were not single-family houses. They were row houses. A local resident told us that in order to get groceries, you had to have a car because you had to drive to another town 7 miles away. He said you could go to the convenience store, so we didn't want to drive, so we went to the convenience store. That store had only junk food, packaged chips, a few cans of food, candy. I felt we were in the third world. This is central Pennsylvania, off the Pennsylvania Turnpike in the rural areas. Most of us just drive through Pennsylvania if we're going from New York State to Chicago or to the Midwest. As I say, this was the third world, and I have seen third world poverty as a result of my work for the State Department when I was on the Fulbright board. Well, subsequently, when I got back, I Googled Mahoney, since I thought it was a microcosm of this region in crisis. What I found was, because it's very hard to get an overall picture, I found out that the local school district was rated by the state of Pennsylvania as 496th out of 498 school districts in the state. The population was declining and had already declined from 25,000 to 15,000 over a period of 25 or 30 years. What happened was every year, youngsters, whether they graduated from high school or not, left. They were not yet encumbered with family, and so they were footloose. So they left out of desperation, and the people who were left in the town, and you could get this data from the internet, the people who were left in the town were the unskilled, the uneducated, mothers with little children, and the elderly. In other words, people in the working ages were leaving because they had to leave. Clearly, the town and others like it are in a death spiral. Declining economic base, increasingly dependent population, dependent on food stamps, Social Security, disability, and other federal resources, and with serious resentment of outsiders. It's no wonder that so many turn to Trump with his simplistic explanations and his false promises. To so many, Obama personified the fact that blacks were getting ahead in modern America. Hillary personified that women were getting ahead in modern America, that there was more equality. Neither one of them spoke to the anger and despair of this population. Some of what happened, and I said this to those of you who've heard me before last year when we were talking about the election, the best way to predict a presidential election after one party has been in power for 2 terms is to say the other party will win. We were all misled by all the polls that suggested that wouldn't happen. But 8 of the 9 times since 1945, where one party was in power for 2 terms, the other party wins. And when you think about it, it's quite logical, because after 8 years, an increased number of people are fed up with the failures of the government, with the problems that have occurred during those 8 years. To so many, Obama was perceived as the enemy, and we know that 12% of the Obama voters in 2012 voted for Trump. For those of us who think in ideological terms, in policy terms, in terms of what policies should be adopted in the country, that doesn't make any sense. Clearly, these are people who are not thinking in those terms. It's natural for us. It's natural for us to ask what can be done. We want to run to the ramparts and save people. That's the logical reaction of many of us. We want to expand the social programs and educational and job opportunities, even though they may have limited impact, and even though it is inevitable that there will be cheating. But if you want to focus on the cheating, and J.D. Vance does that somewhat in his book, he talks about the people who are receiving food stamps and won't even take a job because the job doesn't pay enough, and they don't have to take the job because they have enough income from food stamps and other sources to survive. So definitely there is cheating. J.D. Vance is a conservative. His answer to dysfunctional behavior is tough love. Suck it up yourself, because that's what he did. What he did was he came from this incredibly dysfunctional family background, some of which I've described, and he joined the Marines. His grandparents got him through high school. He was going to drop out of high school. And then he joined the Marines, and after 4 years in the Marines, he was a different person. He had adopted self-discipline because you had to do that to function properly, and they beat that into him. And his next step was 2.5 years at Ohio State University, this potential high school dropout. 2.5 years at Ohio State, at which point he said, he was a little older than undergraduates, why am I hanging around here? Let me get my degree. He earned his degree then in 3 years or so. Didn't do a 4-year college. And his next step was Yale Law School. Well, how the hell do you get into Yale Law School from that background? We know who goes to Yale Law School or Harvard Law School. I went to Yale Law School before I decided I wanted to be a college professor instead. But I had the middle class background with all the efforts on the part of my parents to say education is important, education is central. You will go to, I never considered not going to college. And I'm sure that's true of most of us in this room. We were brainwashed in a positive way, but we were brainwashed into a certain set of thinking about the importance of education, which obviously is not shared in many of the families in this region. So his viewpoint is tough love, suck it up, do it yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very positive. The problem is, how do you get that message through to people who are not sensitive to it? Joe Badgent, who grew up in Appalachia, left the region. He was a newspaper reporter, highly successful in Washington, D.C., and after he retired, he went home and he hung back to where he came from. And his book, Deer Hunting with Jesus, written in 2008, reflects the same set of values that he found among all the other retired men. The guns were important, Jesus was important, puritanical morality was important, etc. But his perspective on the region in his book is a more traditional progressive one, that more can be done to improve education and bring opportunity to the region. I was particularly struck this year when Donald Trump moved to eliminate the Appalachian Regional Commission, ARC, which provides information, data, efforts to improve the region. It's a major player of organizations sponsored, nonprofits sponsored with federal money, primarily, not state money. And Trump wanted to eliminate it because it would save a certain small amount of money as part of his tax plans and his budget plans. And of all things, Senator McConnell from Kentucky said, "Over my dead body will you eliminate the Appalachian Regional Commission," because it was in his interest as a senator from the region to maintain the good work that Appalachian Regional Commission is doing. So that's an example of showing that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, even if it is a dim light. Now, as I said, bringing back coal, cutting taxes for large corporations, which we may see happen. The Senate may pass that tax bill during this week. Amazing that the Senate will pass a major tax bill, the first one since 1986, without a single hearing before passing the tax bill. It makes my head spin because it's so far into my understanding of how our government functions. Cutting taxes for large corporations will help Wall Street, it will help investors, it will help those of us who have our pensions invested partially in the equities. But improving schools, targeted improvement of schools, helping Appalachian cities to grow and prosper, to encourage people to leave the rural communities, providing tax credits for companies that take risks in Appalachia. One of the problems is companies don't want to go there for obvious reasons. The skilled population to take up opportunities doesn't really exist sufficiently, and the geographic isolation is too great. So something has to be done to provide tax credits for people to take risks. But these approaches, more targeted approaches, are not on the agenda of the Trump administration or of the Republican Party in Washington. So we're left with, and this is my final comment, we're left with this analysis with self-help is the only meaningful hope for most of the mountaineers, along the lines of J.D. Vance and what he talks about. You have to help yourself because the amount of help that is available from outside sources is inadequate and frequently fails to do what the proponents of interventionism want to be done. Well, let me stop there. That's not a positive picture, but it's not an entirely negative picture, but it tells us why that one region of the country is so different from the region that we live in. So, we're going to have some time for questions.
We've been aware that reduction of coal production is...
I'm not hearing.
We've been aware for some time of the fact that the coal production is being reduced. My question is, what programming, if any, or what programs have been established for retraining of the people that are losing jobs in mining?
There are retraining programs for people who have lost their jobs, not just in coal mining, but in the manufacturing regions of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Detroit, for example. But they are inadequate and in terms of the amount of effort, and the general feeling is that they haven't been terribly successful. Part of the problem is what people are being retrained for. Most of the retraining is for jobs that do no longer or didn't produce sufficient income. Right now, this country is essentially at full employment. As far as the statistics are concerned, but a lot of that new employment is home health care, for example, fast food, jobs that are minimum wage or higher, slightly higher than minimum wage, that do not reproduce. The coal miners, when they were working, were earning reasonable incomes of $50,000 to $60,000 to even $70,000 a year, and so the retraining tends to get them into jobs that are paying $30,000 a year. In the meantime, the cost of living continues to go up, so there's enormous dissatisfaction. But clearly, more effort has to go into retraining, just as more effort has to go into encouraging kids to stay in high school and finish high school. If you've seen the figures it's absolutely fascinating that there are 2 to 3 million high-skilled jobs that are vacant at the moment, and corporations are saying, we can't find people to do these jobs. One of the dilemmas is that the corporations say, we have to train the people we hire because they come in without the proper skills. And it's quite clear that America never developed an apprenticeship, a good apprenticeship system like the Germans do, because Germany has not lost manufacturing the way the U.S. has lost manufacturing. Our manufacturing relied much more on unskilled labor. Their manufacturing tends to be high-skilled, technical, et cetera, and the people are properly trained to it. We don't, even today, even in liberal circles, we don't talk about reinstating apprenticeship training programs in any serious kind of a way. And the reason for that is because all American parents, or most American parents, believe that their kids should go to college and should go primarily into liberal arts college, and so we're graduating hundreds of thousands of art history and English and French majors who then have to go around and say, what do I do next year? My grandson Alex is graduating in June. He's majoring in political science and Italian. That's a classic example of the dilemma that exists at the present time. So those are very serious issues.
Well, we thank you very much.